You're listening to the Thousand Hills Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Thousand Hills Podcast, where we seek to help mindful theology become powerful faith.
Tonight, guys, we're going to open up to Judges chapter 5, verse 31. That's where we closed last week. So last week we talked about the first couple of Judges and breezed over kind of the first 4 chapters of the book, just giving highlights, names, things that happened. And then we sat down, we talked about Deborah for most of the evening. Tonight we're going to be carrying Pastor to the next judge of note, which is the next judge right after her. Last week we laid out kind of what God had been doing for the history of Israel. There's starting to be some repetition. So we saw them leave Egypt under Moses. Joshua took over from Moses. They go into the promised land, conquer a bunch of it, but they don't take all of it. And as they're sitting in the promised land, they don't do what God told them to do, which is push the Canaanites out of it entirely. They cut deals. They enslave a bunch of other things. They don't conquer their enemy. They don't wipe them out totally. They don't remove them from the land totally. And because of that, they begin a cycle. So following Joshua, we see them start to move away from what God had taught them. We remarked about the fact that it said that the generation after Joshua had no real understanding of what God had done. Which again, terrible for that generation to be so uninformed about God, but also showed a general apathy in the life of the Israelites, as they didn't really pass this down either, seemingly, right? And that started their falling away. That started God going, okay, we're going to go ahead and punish you for this. There's going to be oppression from other nations. And then as they cried out, the judges would rise up. But we pointed out that these periods of time became longer and longer and longer every time they disobeyed and walked away from God. And then we get to see, okay, here's our first judge of note that gets a lot written about them, which is Deborah. She raises up. She helps to confirm the calling on the life of Barak as the military leader of Israel. She tells them, all right, let's go do God's will. They do. They not only push back against their opposition, but they push the enemy out of Israel, kind of doing the work that should have been done originally. And we see God bless them. And then there was a pattern that continues on with Deborah here. Judges chapter 5, verse 31, the very end says, then the land had peace for 40 years. And we talked about the fact that every time a judge was raised up, things went a lot better for them. Israel said, great, we're going to be a part of what God wants to do. We want to leave all these other gods behind us. And then as soon as their judge died, what happened? They went back to the false gods. And it's sad because, again, for us, that's kind of a great picture of the fact that sometimes we're more concerned with what our human leader thinks and does than God, who doesn't come and go, right? Sometimes it's, oh, I would never do that in front of so-and-so. That keeps us in check, not God has called me to better. So when their judges pass away, when their judges finally leave them, the nation succumbs back to the same temptations, right? So again, Deborah's story ends in triumph. We got to see Jael take out Sisera, craziness. God blesses Israel. They do amazing things. And then we go to chapter 6, verse 1. Who wants to read that for me?
The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites.
Yeah. And again, I want to point out to you guys that before Deborah, we'd seen an escalating number of years of oppression for Israel when they disobeyed, right? The first time they disobeyed, they suffered for 8 years of oppression. The next time was 18 years when they rebelled. So the third time, just before Deborah, it had stretched to 20 years. But it seems like God restarted that clock under that revival that Deborah helped to lead with Barak. So it resets to 7 years here, right? And right now, we're going to start that low number. But again, this book of Judges is going to have an ebb and flow if they still disobey and they move further from God. And we're going to see that number inflate to 40 years by the time we get to the last judge. So though Israel's being given a fresh chance here, for though they've seen revival, not just reclamation under Deborah, even though Israel pushed off their oppressors and drove the Canaanites from the promised land like they originally told to, they're now going to follow into that other path that they had been in that's going to lead them towards disaster, right? The chance they had to restart and rededicate themselves is now being squandered. So Midian comes in, begins oppressing them, and it was not a light oppression, right? This was not a very passive time for them. Let's read verses 2 through 6. Who wants to read that for me?
Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help.
What kind of things are going on here, guys? What kind of oppression are we seeing? Takeover? The pillaging is probably the word I'd use, yeah. They're not coming to just lay claim to the land. What are they doing? And they're taking the goods, right? They're allowing the land to continue what they're doing. Their oppression is not just, we want to live where you're living. They're taking what Israel had. What's really interesting about this is, who is Israel trusting in at this time? Who knows the God that they were turning to repeatedly? What his name was? What was he the God of? Weather. He was the God they followed for good crops. So as they're following this God for good crops, what's happening to their crops? Oh, you're getting good crops for someone else. Oh, your livestock's healthy, but God's not protecting you. What good did it do them? None. They turned away seeking after wealth. We can just get what we want. And God goes, oh yeah, you're going to get right up into the point where you might get to enjoy it, and then someone else is going to take it. How defeating would that be? You pour your life into this, and someone else eats it. You pour your life into it, and you know that at the end of the season, they're going to come and take. They're going to leave nothing for you. They're not concerned about you. There's not going to be any payoff for your labor. This is a beating down God is allowing, right? We talk about when rebellions get put down, right? There's a demoralization going on here. They're not just defeated as in they're not defending themselves. Emotionally, spiritually, they're being treated not only as not a threat, but as someone they can continue to capitalize upon without fear. They don't even need to kill them. They have so much power over them, right? Another thing that we get to look at this as well, this affliction, is that the Midianites in verse 3 are spoken of as an eastern people, right? And it says that they ruin the crops all the way to Gaza. Who knows where Gaza is in Israel right now? Well, yeah, what direction is Gaza in? It's in the very south and the very... Midian was in the very south and the very east. If you're pillaging from the east all the way into Gaza, you're pillaging across the entire width of the nation. This was not just small and local. They are sweeping across an entire part of Israel, and they are not able to be stopped. Like locusts. Yep. So again, Israel turned their back on God in pursuit of prosperity. So God sees fit to allow them to be stripped of all their comforts and success because they weren't reliant on Him for their survival. And God is trying to show them that their existence without Him would be this. If Israel historically had not had God backing them, let me ask you guys, were they spoken of as a great nation at any time when they were not following God? Any great battles being won? Any great portions of land being taken? Never in the history of Israel are they spoken of as being powerful, imposing anything when the blessing of God did not rest on them. In fact, when we see the greatest amount of wealth and influence, it's under a certain king. Does anybody know the king's name? Solomon, right? He accrued great wealth. What comes immediately after Solomon? The kingdom splits because those who came after Solomon had no regard for God. They were the greatest nation at that time going. Powerful. They had wealth, everything. And in one generation, it's gone. God allows it to be shattered, right? This is what Israel would be like. They would be on their knees and dominated if God had not led them out of Egypt, had not provided their needs, had not defended them from their enemies, had not handed them the promised land, and simply told them to obey. And the result of this is a cry for deliverance. Israel's going, we need God now, right? Who wants to read Judges 6, verses 7 through 10?
When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, He sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me.
What does God do here? He sends a mouthpiece. He sends a prophet, right? God is reminding Israel of what they had chosen to set aside and educates them on their history and how it was marked by the love of God, the power of God, the care of God, and yet also continued disobedience from Israel. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And I'll remind you of their time when they exited Egypt. They exit Egypt. Moses goes up to get the Ten Commandments. What do? They build an idol. Immediately, right? And what do they attribute to that idol? Why do they worship that idol? They say, this is the God that led us from Egypt. They took what God had done and they attribute it to a false idol. What do you think was going on right now in the history of Israel as they're worshiping Baal? They were probably attributing the blessing of God, the things that had happened, to a false God. God reminds them, it was not your false gods that blessed you. It was not the false gods that protect you. It was not the false gods that led you. It was me, right? And I appreciate that even before God sends a deliverer, God teaches a lesson. Israel was praying for relief from their current struggle. They're going, we need relief from the Midianites, right? But God knew they needed relief from something far bigger. They needed to reset their foundation so they would have a chance at sustained success. And they needed to grow away from the things that had brought them to this ruin. And this is a great note for us to take. Often, like Israel, we can feel the suffering and desire relief from different parts of our life, right? And yet if we don't take time to ask where our suffering began, we're going to end up in the same situation again, right? Let me ask you, in a company that is falling apart, do you think the problem started the first day market shares began to dip? No, that's just the sign that something bad was happening in there, right? In a failing marriage, do you think the problems that are destroying the relationship began with the latest fight? And let's be honest, do you think they began when the marriage began? Or perhaps there was remnants of things there before that were never grown out of, never apologized for, never fixed, right? Israel needs to get at the core of what has caused these issues, right? And often the suffering we feel is the byproduct of unaddressed issues or sins. The pain is the last step in a process of rot. The oppression Israel is suffering is the end product of years of heart-deep disobedience that became a nationwide spiritual rebellion. So God fixes the heart first, and then he goes out to send that deliverer from the problems. And in our lives, we need to realize that too. Perhaps even before we pray for deliverance from our issues, the problems, the situations that are causing us stress, pray that we are able to be blessed by God, that we forsake the things that sometimes bring on these issues, or that we learn the lesson from the struggle, because sometimes we didn't put ourselves in that struggle, and yet God's going, but I want you to learn something from it. So don't just pray to get out of it, pray to grow in the midst of it, even if, again, it wasn't totally your fault. Israel, in this case, not hands clean on this. This is definitely of their doing, though, right? Let's read verses 11 and 12. Who wants to read that?
The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior."
Great. You guys want to know a fun fact? That first name, Ophrah, that's actually where we got Oprah Winfrey's name. They misspelled on our birth certificate. That's how we got Oprah. Yeah. Just a fun little thing there, all right? Not a Bible fact, but, involves the Bible. Let's note a contrast here, guys, all right? Let's note the contrast between, and this is wild shred, but let's say it, between what Gideon currently is and what God has called him to be. Who knows what a wine press is used for? Pressing grapes so you can get wine, right? Very straightforward use. What is he doing with it? Threshing wheats. You think it'd be in the name and easy enough to figure out what you're supposed to do with this. It's not for no reason. Wine presses were big, and they're usually underground. All right? He's hiding. He's misusing equipment to make sure that they don't find him. He's not doing this properly. It's not even the most effective way to do it. This is just a good way not to get caught. So you have a man there, seeing the enemy coming, fears them, goes, I'm just going to have enough for myself right now. He's not providing for the community. It's for him, right? He wants something to eat. And he goes, I have no chance against this enemy. I'm scared of the enemy. I'm just going to go secretly make myself some food, right? That guilty pleasure midnight snack. And he is actively hiding again from the enemy when the angel of the Lord appears to him and calls him what? Mighty warrior. Yeah, man of valor is the other translation. Either way, is this a man of valor? Is this? Yeah, I was about to say, do we go to the battlefront and like, who's scared of the enemy? You, get up here, it's time. No, right? Those people are deserters. Those people are not the people we want. And yet God goes, hey, this is who I need, right? Even though at this moment, nothing can be further from the truth physically. And equally, internally, Gideon is not a man walking in great faith. I want us to read verse 13.
Pardon me, my lord, Gideon replied, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian.
So, someone appears to him, right? And says, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And what's his retort? Oh, well, pardon me. If the Lord is with us, why are we in this mess? That is either spoken sassily or that is spoken in absolute terror, where his heart is just crying out. And he's going, you know what? I would love for that to be the truth, but it's not. If God was with us, we wouldn't be here right now, right? He's saying, I have heard of the works that God did. And wonderfully, he attributes Egypt and things like that to God. But he looks at this and goes, if God was with us, we wouldn't be suffering like this. Again, how relatable. You put yourself in suffering. You feel like God's near or far. And we are convinced God is just a far way off, right? Gideon in the same way goes, look, God has to have abandoned us for us to be in this state of, being put under the control of Midian here. And again, this retort shows the heart we talked about earlier. Despite Israel's betrayal of God, who's being held responsible for the failing? He's holding God responsible. He's not saying Israel has fallen away. He's not saying Israel left God. He says God has abandoned Israel, right? Rather than we have rejected God and fallen from underneath the blessing. And Gideon asks, why has this happened to us, right? As if Israel is somehow innocent in this, when nothing could be further from the truth. Verse 14, it says, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have. For those of us online, things fell in the room. We do, the Holy Ghost is a part of the Godhead. I'll read verse 14. It says, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? How interesting. What strength did Gideon have? What?
This is the Lord.
Mm-hmm. This is not just an angel. The angel of the Lord is a very specific phrase. We're going to touch on that in a second. What's the word? Theophany is what we have here. It's an appearance of God in the Old Testament where it's still veiled. It's not God's full presence. But it also happens like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story where there's a fourth man in the fire. It's the angel of the Lord. And you're like, that's not just any angel, right? God is with them in the midst of this. So yes, it's not just some random angel. God wasn't like, we'll just send a foot soldier. He's going directly to Gideon with this news, right? That's why is not the Lord sending you, am I not sending you, right? But what strength does Gideon have that he's referring to? Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. This is not a trade warrior. This man is not standing on the corpse of 60 soldiers he just slew, right? What strength is he referring to? He's clever. That's a fair observation. He's definitely clever. What other strength might you think he possesses right here? I think there's a strength in him not having any illusion that he's adequate to the job. There's a humility here. He's not the person going, well, I'm just this nationalistic. I'm just going to go out in a blaze of glory. It's a little pathetic, but at the same time, he's not holding himself up as some hero. When he's told, you're going to go save the people, his response isn't, yeah, I'm the man for the job. What's his response? What can I possibly do, right? What can I possibly do? God is not here with us. What chance do we have, right? And again, I love this because for Gideon, he accuses God of having abandoned Israel, right? And yet God's here talking to him. He's saying, I haven't abandoned you. In fact, I'm here to send you as my proxy, as my deliverer for the people, as my judge from this peril, right? And this should be a relief to Gideon because he sees the oppression, hates the oppression, and is now being told that God is sending him as that needed relief. And yet again, he looks at himself and goes, what am I supposed to do? Verses 15 and 16. Here's that phrase again. Pardon me, my Lord. Gideon replied, so it's going to be sassy. But how can I save Israel? No illusion that he's the right man for the job. He says, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I am the least in my family. Verse 16, the Lord answered, I will be with you, and I will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. What's his retort to this? My family is the weakest, and I am the weakest of my family. That is his strength, I believe. No illusions, no pride in this. Laying himself down, going, you need to get a better deliverer, God, right? There's irony here, though. And I love how little Gideon understands because God says, I will be with you. I'm sending you to do this, right? For basically the second time. Gideon, again, claims God abandoned them despite God being in front of him. He speaks of God delivering Israel from a more powerful nation, Egypt. And what was the story of Israel being released from Egypt? Was it Moses showed up, he drew his sword, cut down the Pharaoh, said, let's go, guys. How did they get out of Egypt? If you know God delivered Israel, you must know how God delivered Israel. And it wasn't some great war story. It wasn't they overwhelmed. They were tactically superior. They were Black Ops agents, SEAL Team 6, nothing like that, right? The story of their deliverance is through miraculous plagues. And yet for some reason, as God is giving him these instructions, he thinks that his inadequacies are going to be the things that keep God from doing his will. Right? He's over here going, I can't do anything to fight the Midianites, right? I have not enough cunning or strength, as if God won't be the one delivering him and delivering Israel and empowering him through this whole operation. How funny that we can look at God's previous works and go, but I stand in the way, as if God wasn't the one who did those previous works, right? Wonderful to have reverence for godly leaders. The godly leader was not the point. We read last week about Deborah, and we said that if we reduce this story to a story about gender, we reduce this story to the greatness of one person, we miss the point. This is a story about God and about the people who are humble and willing. This is the same thing. He's missing the point. He's not going to be the thing that people think about, oh, wow, the great deliverers of Israel. As we read about the judges, we're reading about pathetic people, weak people, sinful people, but we're reading about a mighty God. We're reading about a just God. We're reading about God who does not abandon the people who deserve to be abandoned because of his own goodness and promises, right? That's the thing that we're supposed to take from this book. Gideon needs to look beyond himself and understand that God can work through him even despite him, right? So God quickly corrects him. It will be God's doing. He will destroy the army through Gideon. So why would this have been Gideon's reaction? I would like to think that Gideon would have had a stronger freedom fighter type of vibe to him, but in reality, how does he come across? Scared, hopeless, cowardly. These are not the character traits of a hero, right? And as we read along, we'll come to realize that God did not call this mighty warrior, this man of valor, due to his qualifications. And he would grow Gideon through his whole story. He would grow Gideon into that powerful warrior. Not by making him powerful with a sword, not by making him super smart and cunning, but by growing the power of his faith in what God could do with him, through him, right? And for Israel. This process, however, would not be quick and it would not be painless. The rest of our story is going to be an incremental growth story, and I love it to death. Who wants to read verses 17 through 22?
Gideon replied, If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face."
Great. What's important about this text is that Gideon finally understands who he was talking to. So what should happen next in our ideal story? Go fight the Midianites. What was that? You shouldn't doubt, right? No doubt. Get out there. Do the work. Awesome. We're finished. That's not how the story goes. Let's read verses 23 through 27. It says, "But the Lord said to him, 'Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die.' So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, 'The Lord is Peace.' And to this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites," or I'm going to butcher that name, but I'm sorry. Verse 25, "That same night the Lord said to him, 'Here's your first instructions. Take the second bull from your father's herd and the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal or Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. Using the wood from the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering.'" Verse 27, "So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he," what? "Was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than the daytime." Homie just saw God. He was given very clear instructions. You're not going to die. Now go do this. What is his response? Obedience, but fearful obedience, right? He obeys, but there's still very much real limitations. Gideon obeys, but the fear of men is more powerful than his faith in God in that moment. He has already realized that God Almighty has talked to him and said that his calling is to destroy the armies of the Midianites by God's power. And yet he fears for some reason the people who worship these false idols, and that they somehow may thwart God's plan, either by arresting him or maybe killing him, right? And for sake of time, I will let you know that the people, having seen in the morning what he did indeed want to kill him. All right? They're going, things are bad enough and now you're insulting the gods. They told Gideon's father to bring Gideon to them, but he said that if Baal was truly God, well then why shouldn't he defend himself, right? The people agreed on that, but they renamed Gideon Jerubbaal, meaning basically, let Baal deal with him. In other words, you're a marked man, right? Gideon is beginning his journey of obedience, and it's a beautiful thing because even as he obeys, his faith seems to be lagging behind. And this is a neat picture for Christians nowadays. We often feel as though we need to have an all-powerful faith before we venture out in obedience, don't we? When there's a need, we're like, oh, I can't do that. I'm not holy yet. Oh, you're going to be holy one day? You're going to be holy enough for the task? You're going to be adequate to the task one day? No, absolutely not, right? We often feel like we need to have a perfect relationship with God before we serve at church, or have to have every part of our relationship with God figured out before we can accomplish anything for God. And yet, as we read ahead, we see Gideon take the actions of obedience even as his faith is growing to catch up. It's a beautiful thing for us, guys. Sometimes God calls us beyond our ability. That's okay, all right? Let's be very clear. A 27-year-old who is trying to start a church is out of his depth. But here we are, all right? Moses, a man who stuttered, had shortcomings, right? Goes, God, I'm the wrong person. Cannot go and impose his will upon a Pharaoh. He is out of his depth, right? Look at any Bible story. God puts people well beyond their ability. And yet, if they can obey and they see God move, what happens to their faith? It grows to catch up. That's okay to see that process taking place in our lives. But you know what? When we sit down and go, I need to be faithful enough, be righteous enough, be holy enough to do these things, what it actually does is not encourage our dedication and growing our faith. It stymies it. It stunts it. Because you know what? Without that challenge, growth doesn't happen. Okay? We talked in Romans about suffering, growing into hope, right? But it comes through the midst of perseverance and the growth and then the character, right? For us, if you want to grow with your relationship with God, if you want to see your faith grow, allow God to lead you out of your comfort zone, beyond your ability, in a place where you're going, I need to grow just to be able to withstand this challenge. All right? And that might be in a ministry that you're like, that was never the ministry I wanted to be in. That might be in a friendship where you're like, you know what? This person's crazy. Yes, and you probably were too at one point, all right? Love them anyways. It might be into discussions where you're like, I don't know enough Bible facts. I want to know all the scriptures to retort. It's okay to say, I don't know. But then go back to your Bible and study, and guess what? You'll become more educated on the topic. It's okay to say, I know a pastor. I know another more mature Christian. I have this great resource. Let's do it together. Awesome. You will grow as God leads you out and you obey. And your faith will catch up. And at the end of it all, if you've done what you're supposed to do, that faith grows and grows and grows. And you know what? You learn to submit yourself to the fact that it's not so scary the next time. And then you watch yourself grow. And then it's not so scary the next time because you grow this repetition, this pattern of, I step out, God moves. I don't know how he's going to move. I don't know where he's going to move. I don't know what he's going to call me to next. But I move and God meets me. And you know what? Let's be really clear. That doesn't mean that we can't disqualify ourselves from calling. But at the same time, the moment that we think we're the point, we're cooked. The moment we think that our qualifications means that we can do something mighty for God, we're cooked. All right? We should be studied. We should be ready. We should be up to the task. We should meet the biblical standard for the things that we do. I can't go out and not read my Bible and be like, I'm going to be an evangelist. Do what you can. Yet at the same time, if you're following God and doing what you're supposed to, God might lead you in a place where you're like, I'm not qualified for this. And he's like, but I am, and I called you, and let's do it. All right? Let's read 33 through 35.
Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them.
Beautiful. We see promising actions of obedience, right? And the next few verses, we're going to see his fear, and we're going to see his desire for reassurance as his faith grows to catch up. He does what he's supposed to, and I love it. It says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. When we see this in the lives of the judges and people in the Old Testament, God is moving mightily. And you know what? In your lives, there might be moments where you're like, oh, God is moving right now. I'm doing this. Let's go. And you see great faith in their life. And then the next day you're like, what did I do? There's times where you step out, great faith, and you're like, oh my goodness, right? Gideon has this moment. 3 verses 36 through 40, it says, Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you promised, as you what? Does God break those? Does God go back on those? Why is Israel still around despite their disobedience? A promise. This man knows the truth, and he's like, if you're really going to do what you promised, verse 37, look, I've placed a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. Verse 38, and that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. So then he goes off and fights, right? Verse 39, then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Yeah, okay, for sure. This is not going to be his last request, just for the record. Allow me one more test with the fleece. And this time, make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. That night, God did so. Only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. God is so gracious with Gideon. And he is with us as well. God doesn't just expect us to muster enough faith to do what we need to. He is patient to give us every chance to obey him despite our fears and shortcomings. In the end, the instructions are the same. But God is leading Gideon and will lead us bit by bit into the paths He has called us to if we are humble enough to follow Him. And guys, again, this is a great picture of we know the truth and yet we fear. We know that God is who He is and yet we fear. There's no doubt he has heard from God and yet he fears, right? God does not strike him with lightning and go, the next man up is the one I'm going to use now. And he was not ignorant of these failings of Gideon, and yet he called him all the same. The strength of this man was, again, not his qualifications, not that he looked the part. This isn't Rambo. This was a humble man, and a humble man full of fear that God would help wring out of him like he wrung the dew out of that fleece, right? And again, for sake of time, we speed through to the major parts of the next chapter. Here we're going to be in Judges chapter 7, verse 1. And we see the pattern continue with God patiently growing Gideon's faith. Verses 1 through 3 say, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. Verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. Oh, I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel will boast against me. What are they going to say? My own strength has saved me. Verse 3, now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left. Well, how many remained? 10,000. You lost more than 2/3 of your standing army, okay? Let's establish something that I love in this chapter. We read in the next chapter that the army Gideon was facing was 135,000 strong. 135,000 strong, all right? If those were dollars, you're getting a nice pickup, all right? You're getting a Land Rover, a Range Rover, something, right? We just read that Gideon originally had 32,000 men. So to begin with, Gideon, who is an untrained, untested leader, is leading an army of untrained, untested soldiers into a battle where each of his men would be outnumbered just over 4-1. It's like 4.2-1, right? And what's God's complaint? It's too competitive. It's going to be too easy a fight for them. Again, to throw that in perspective, if every one of Gideon's soldiers died, but they killed 4 people, they still would have lost the fight by 0.2. Gideon is probably already terrified, as we would be in his shoes, right? Of what's going to come next. And yet God tells him to cut down the number of men he's taking. Because God wants Israel not to say that it was their victory, but to see victory as something that came through the power of God and his deliverance rather than the power of their army. I assure you that Gideon must have been sick to his stomach to think of losing even one man, let alone more than 2/3 of his army. And yet, what does he do? Exactly as God asked. That's growth. This battle, again, had turned now from a 4-on-1 fight to a 13-to-1 fight. That means, again, if every soldier dies but they take 13 people with them, it's a draw. All right? They're not supposed to win this fight. But it's a wonderful step in the right direction for Gideon. 3 verses 4 through 7, and it says, but the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. Gideon has the choice to head for the tree line. All right, I'm just going to throw that out there. He could have been like, we're going to the desert, boys. We are not going to the water, right? He says, if I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. All right, the first time when they thinned the army, maybe he couldn't have said a rousing enough speech to get the scared guys back. This time he can lie. All right, God's speaking through him and to him, not to the army directly, right? So God's going, you're going to obey me, and you're going to know the truth. Now follow what I tell you to do. It says, so Gideon, in verse 5, took the men down to the water. Then the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. Verse 6, 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down their knees to drink. Verse 7, the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. Guys, this test has a most particular bit of, symbolicness. To do anything in those days, quote, like a dog, was not a flattering comparison. All right? Dogs were not loved. We had no golden retrievers laying on beds at night, right? A dog was a dirty, lower than creature, right? So when God takes these people, he not only chooses a smaller number of people, but he chooses those who might have been viewed as undignified to do his work here. And this wasn't anything new for God. Again, he chose an elderly Abraham and Sarah to father and mother a nation, right? Well past their childbearing years. The badly spoken Moses was chosen to lead Israel and serve as God's mouthpiece and representation to Pharaoh, and to call Israel a nation, as he did, that was enslaved and dominated every time that they relied on their own strength. Those are the ones he chose to be his people. He chose the unqualified, the downtrodden, the thought low. He thought of the people who had no chance on their own, that others would look at and go, how pathetic. And he went, those are mine. That's who I'm going to use, right? God composes his army out of a fearful and unqualified leader and the lowliest men, who are now outnumbered 453 to 1. 453 to 1. So that there would be no doubt that it was his power that brought deliverance to Israel. Again, if you are that unqualified person, if you are that lowly, you are that unspecial person, you may have a strength like Gideon and his army did. God might be waiting to use you, knowing that no one would ever look at you and think, oh yeah, they have it all together. So when amazing things happen, they have no choice but to attribute it to God. Who wants to read Judges chapter 7, verses 8 through 11? Do it, Hannah.
So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp.
Again, love this peak. What did God say to him? You can do this if what? And he immediately goes. There's no pretense here. There's no I'm gonna have a stiff upper lip. No, God, I'm brave enough. Immediately, he's like, all right, cool. Let's go do that. Let's get that reassurance, right? Verses 12 through 15, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley. Mary Grace, you gave us a good comparison. Thick as locusts. How many of us were here for the locust every summer? You can't drive your car without getting covered. You can't step through the churchyard without stepping on a few. You can't open a door without them coming in, right? It says the camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore, all right? Verse 13, Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. Verse 14, his friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite." How exact! God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Verse 15, then Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation. He bowed down in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Again, we might be humored by the idea of hardened soldiers being frightened of a loaf of bread, but there was a symbolic significance here. Barley was a meal of the extremely poor or animals, okay? In other words, the Midianites are having the realization Israel will soon overrun them, and it's not by the power or the pedigree of the army or the opposing soldiers they fear, it's God. They do not think there's a well-trained army, that there's the cream of the crop army. They're not saying they went out and they got the Egyptian army and their chariots to come out. They're claiming that God is working here. And they know the name of the leader God has selected. What in the world, right? God blessed them with a terrible revelation of what was about to happen. And they didn't know how it would happen. So this is an ominous peek into the future. For them, they're going, God's about to do something, and we're going to be on the receiving end of it. And this is probably spreading around the camp now. Verses 16 through 22 say this: dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all the men with torches inside. Watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And let's point something out here. This is not Gideon trying to get name recognition, right? These people already know his name. This is not going to achieve his fame, but this is fulfilling that prophecy about, you're correct. It is Gideon and it is God, and we're coming for you, right? Verse 19. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and they broke the jars that were in their hands. Verse 20. 3 companies blew their trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Verse 21. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying as they fled. They're terrified. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meloah near Tabith. Let's point something out real quick. The soldiers have torches and jars, and what in their other hand? They have horns. What do they not have in their hands? Or shields. Where are they located right now? They're right at the edge of the camp. So if I'm going to approach my enemy, what do I maybe want to have in my hand? If I'm getting ready for a fight, do you think I want to be holding a torch, a jar, and a horn? And they had swords with them, mind you. We're going to read about that in a second, right? Gideon gives careful instructions here, and it seems to be perfectly in step with God's plan, meaning it probably didn't originate from his great thinking, right? God had already struck terror into the hearts of the people, and now Gideon accentuates that by instructing the army to do something incredibly uncommon. His instructions are the exact opposite of a sneak attack, right? If you have the enemy in bed, and they have the numbers, and it's the middle of the night, what do? You sneak and you stab everybody, right? Because you know what? Eventually they're going to wake up to what's going on, but at least you've done some damage, and maybe there's some advantage here, right? What do they do instead? They give themselves away, right? His instructions are the opposite of the sneak attack. He doesn't tell them to draw their swords and leap into the fray. He says to smash jars, revealing torches, and blow trumpets. How would this go ordinarily? If you're outnumbered 453 to 1, and you decide to announce your presence at the edge of the enemy camp, what's the end result going to be? Your death. That's a suicide mission. You're gone, right? It's a sure and quick death. Noisy death, yeah, exactly. Announcing, here I am, archers, target practice. No swords, no shields, do what you need, right? And for some people I've heard teach on this, they said those torches probably represented a company of soldiers. Meaning, yeah, like you're saying, you have a heck of a lot more men there. You're unprepared, and it looks like at very least a close to even fight, if not more people over the hill coming for you. That is terrifying. There's noise reverberating. You are awakened suddenly, right? Due to God's influence in the heart of the soldiers and the dreams he gave them, right? The opposite of a quick death occurs. The enemy army suddenly awakes to torches everywhere around them, and interpret that to mean that there's a large force there to kill them. And in the midst of this chaos, Israel blows their trumpets, which would signal what? It's a charge. That ordinarily means they're going to start breaking our lines, coming down that hill, coming for our throats, right? So suddenly the enemy army thinks that the crowd pressing up against them might now include enemy soldiers. And they'll be darned if they're going to be the one who gets stabbed. So they draw their swords and turn on each other. In their terror, they start killing one another. What must this have looked like to the army? They must have been scared too. My instructions are give my position away, hold a torch so they know exactly where I'm at, and blow my horn. And then after you do this, the army starts killing each other. You're just standing there. All right. Well done, right? Exactly, right? You're just hearing this clash, and you know no one has walked into that crowd. You're just like, all right. Not only that, but this army then bolts for the border, with Israel's army pursuing and killing them. And in the end, Gideon and his army of 300 end up completely wiping out the enemy to the last man. This is a wonderful picture of what God does through the weak but willing. God led Gideon and didn't despise his shortcomings. He knew the fear that was in Gideon's heart, and yet he honored the fact that in spite of his fear, Gideon sought to obey. And through that obedience, as we read about his story, we see his faith grow. He grew from disobedience from disbelief into belief that God was sending him. Then from belief God was sending him into obeying God's order to tear down the altar of Baal or Baal, but under the cover of night. He grew from needing the cover of night to publicly blowing that horn and calling together an army to lead. But even at that point, he's so scared that he asked God to send more signs with the fleeces. But from that comes more faith to the point of being willing to send most of the army away in obedience. But even there, he's scared, so he has to go down and hear what these soldiers are saying until God finally gives him one last sign through that fear of the enemy. It wasn't until the last moment of Gideon's story that he seems to fully conquer his fear, right? And yet God accomplished great things through this willing, shaky, obedient, and ultimately faith-filled heart. We read in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, Gideon's name, meaning he grew into what God was calling him to be. He didn't need to start there. In our lives, we may not look the part. We may be plagued by fear. We see ourselves as overmatched. And heck, that might be the truth. Yet if we can simply seek out God's will and follow his leading and allow those actions to grow our faith, I promise you there's nothing God cannot do through you. Had this been the end of Gideon's story, he would have a story very akin to Deborah's, right? But instead, we're going to see something else. We have the first judge who will succumb to the rot that had infected the heart of Israel. Gideon would face a test of humility later on that would knock him off his track. We're going to skip ahead. In Judges 8:22, following this all, the Israelites asked Gideon to be their king and to have his sons and grandsons rule over them. And in reply to this, Gideon says, I will not rule over you, nor will my sons. The Lord will rule over you. Great, good answer, right? Except his actions didn't follow his words. From here, he collects gold from the men of Israel who had taken it as plunder, and he forms the gold into an ephod. And an ephod, guys, was a shirt or a chest plate that was worn by the priests. And this would have marked Gideon as someone holy and important. Some believe this was due to a grudge he had with the people of Ephraim. Some believe this was just notoriety for him. But this ephod is said to have caused Gideon, all of his family, and all of Israel to stumble. Israel, it says, played the harlot with it, meaning, again, they were unfaithful to God spiritually due to making this an idol. Gideon also did two other things that marked himself as something more than his countrymen. We know that he took many wives, had 70 sons, right? More daughters, but 70 sons. That was the mark of somebody saying, I can provide. And all the kings around did the same thing. The common man in Israel was not called to polygamy. God blessed marriage, husband, wife, y todo. That's it, done. But what do we see from people like David and Solomon and other rulers? Multiple wives, family dysfunction. We see very much a lack of blessing on many of the children that come from those situations, right? Not only that, one of these sons that he had was not with a wife, but with a concubine. And he names him Abimelech. which means my father, a king. Which would serve as an open claim to control after the death of Gideon. Not only is it a recognition of your position, but it's a recognition of a hereditary bloodline of rulers. For the first time ever, Israel didn't wait to chase after other gods until the death of their judge. During Gideon's life, they would serve Baal, while Gideon lived and breathed, and would even credit Baal as the God who their nation was in covenant with again. Basically saying it was Baal who had delivered them from the Midianites and even Egypt. And because of Gideon's actions, when he dies, a power struggle breaks out. And his son, Abimelech, making a claim to the throne, rallies his mother, the concubine's people, to support him, going off to have all but one of his brothers killed. It means Gideon's descendants end rather quickly. They've won. From there, he puts down an uprising from within his own supporters and his mother's people, and then massacres them too. In other words, there was an uprising that kind of came from the outside within the people that he beat down, and then he looked at the people and say, "You didn't do that yourself, so now I'm going to punish you." He let the people walk out into the fields and then cut them down. Then he destroyed the city that they lived in and salted the earth so it would not be rebuilt for another 200 years. And then Abimelech's life ultimately ends when he attempts to lead siege to another city, has a millstone dropped off a tower onto his head by a woman. Go jails. And begged one of his men to kill him so that a woman wouldn't get the glory for killing him. And he obliges. Guys, the strength of humility that once marked Gideon seems to have eroded over time. He became a bold man rather than an obedient one. And where fear had once rested, it was replaced not with faith in God, but with faith in himself. And there is a moral for us in this too. Many Christians can surrender to God and withstand immense tragedy and pain and personal disaster. Okay? When we see our lives go off the rails, we can surrender to God in powerful ways. Sometimes we go into that fight or flight mode. We grit our teeth and we're going, I'm going to spiritually fight now. Amazing. The opposite of a fair weather Christian though, right? Because just as dangerous as having your faith stomped out in those times of crisis is not being careful. And when times of peace and happiness or personal achievement come, we let our guard down and we stray. For Gideon, when the press was on, he was there. He was about it. But when God blessed them with peace, when there was recognition and different things like that, he allowed his relationship to become a thing of the past tense, right? Had Gideon remained in times of struggle, he may have remained soft-hearted, obedient, and faithful. But at some point, he instead embraced comfort and his accomplishments, being content to talk about the good old days when God spoke to him and moved, rather than continuing to seek out that personal relationship in the later stages of his life. For us, the lesson, the end of Gideon's life is that we must do everything to avoid the same fate. Don't have a life that starts with a bang and ends with a whimper. For us, if we step out and we see that growth, our response to it should not be, yeah, I am a pretty good leader, aren't I? Should not be no one else has done that, so God clearly saw some sort of talent, as if for like NBA draft picks or something. God just got a really good farm system. Those young arms are coming up. AAA. God was not identifying someone with immense talent. He was identifying a humble heart and a life full of obedience. And a man that no one would look at and said it was him. So that he could work through it and receive the glory. Right? For us, there might be moments of that. We might be the unlikeliest person. Praise God for the blessing in that. But then when you go back home after the amazing breakthrough, after you've been praying and God answers, after that moment of warmth and closeness is there and the Devo time is sweet or the worship time moved you to tears, don't go home and be the person you were before. Build on it and grow and stay surrendered and stay obedient and stay dependent on God. Sunday we talked about the fact that our goal is not to be so spiritually competent That we no longer look to God and we're like, no, I got it. I'm a good Christian. I'm a good person. Don't worry. Oh no, patience? I have patience. I don't need to pray God for patience. That's the moment you snap. That's the moment you break. For us as Christians, if we are mature, we just recognize how quickly we can slide out of alignment with God, right? The real strength and maturity of a Christian is recognizing you don't go back from God and then return. You just stay there as best you can, and you save yourself some of the steps, right? For Gideon, he was once there. And he allowed himself to step away, step away, step away. And I'll tell you guys something too that a worship instructor told me, and it's sad, because it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sat in a car with an unnamed worship instructor and had a conversation. And he said being a worship leader is one of the most dangerous positions in the church. He says because they don't vet you. They put you in front of the stage, in front of the lights and everything like that. They give you almost an equal time to the preacher of the church, perhaps the church founder, the person who runs the church and oversees everything, right? Equal acclaim for some people, if not more, because, hey, music's great, right? They allow you to work in a way that is showy in front of everyone. And they don't warn you, about the fact that you are standing incredibly close to the glory. And he said glory is radioactive. You can only be in the presence of God's glory for so long and so close before you start to poison yourself. And he says in the moment that you step into God's glory, it's like that radioactivity. It starts to double over. It's no longer just like an addition thing. At some point, it becomes to the power of whatever. He's saying worship leaders who stand in the glory of God, the more glory they take for themselves and away from God and away from the work that he's doing, the less glory they give God themselves, the quicker they drop out of ministry. Gideon's a wonderful example of that. The more glory he absorbed, the worse it turned out, right? And for us, the same thing. Deflect. If God has done something in your life and someone goes, oh, I just love the fact that Kylie has this thing about her. It's God, it's not me. Get out of the way of that glory. It's not good for you. You're not going to be able to stand it, right? And God will not share. Spiritual maturity is proximity sometimes and backing away from those things. Oh, by the way, then that worship person became the dean of the school, immediately took glory for everything, left his wife for one of the students. The student left him when his marriage fell apart, and he fell away from God. So, wow. He was right. And he's a perfect example of it. Far be it from us. Please, God, keep us away from it. But, wonderful example.
Thank you for listening to today's message. If you would like to listen to more messages like this, you can find us on Spotify and iTunes by searching for Thousand Hills Podcast. Thank you for listening to and supporting this ministry of Thousand Hills Church.